Sarah Jenkins had never thought she would one day stand on a stage in front of hundreds of people. Her life had been quiet, simple, and filled with small routines that made her comfortable. She lived in a small town where everyone knew each other's names. She worked at a local bakery, waking up before sunrise to bake bread and muffins for the morning customers. Her days were filled with the smell of sugar and cinnamon, and her nights were spent listening to old songs on the radio, the same songs she used to sing to herself when she was younger. For as long as she could remember, Sarah loved to sing when she was a little girl. She would stand in front of her mirror, holding a hairbrush like a microphone, pretending she was performing in front of thousands of fans. Her parents used to smile and clap for her, but as she grew older, life became busy. Her dreams were pushed aside, replaced by bills, work, and responsibilities. Years went by, and she sang only when she was alone in the kitchen or when the shop was empty. Her voice still beautiful, but hidden from the world. One evening, while closing the bakery, she noticed a poster taped to the window of a nearby cafe. It said National Talent Search auditions this weekend. She stopped and stared at it, her heart beating a little faster. The idea sounded impossible. She was in her 40s, had never performed publicly, and had no fancy clothes or training, but something inside her whispered, why not? And for the first time in years, she felt a spark of courage. The next morning, she told her best friend Emily about the audition. Emily laughed gently, not in a mean way, but with disbelief. You? On TV? That's so brave, she said. You've got a lovely voice, Sarah. But those shows are full of young stars, Sarah smiled shyly. She knew Emily meant well, but the comment made her doubt herself again. Still, she couldn't stop thinking about the poster. It followed her all day like a tune she couldn't forget. On the day of the audition, Sarah woke up before dawn. She put on her simplest blue dress, brushed her hair, and packed a small bag with her sheet music and a bottle of water. She took a long look in the mirror. Her reflection stared back at her. A woman with tired eyes but a strong heart. You've got nothing to lose, she whispered to herself, and left for the bus station. The city felt enormous compared to her town. Bright lights, loud horns, and crowds of people rushing everywhere. Sarah clutched her bag tightly as she walked toward the theater where the auditions were being held. Outside, a long line of hopeful contestants stretched around the block. Young girls with glittering dresses, confident boys practicing dance moves, and singers humming scales to warm up their voices. Sarah felt completely out of place when she reached the registration desk. The young assistant looked at her and asked, "Are you here to watch someone?" Sarah smiled nervously. "No, I'm here to audition." The assistant blinked, surprised, then handed her a number tag. "Good luck," he said politely. Sarah pinned the tag to her dress and sat quietly, watching the others rehearse. She could hear bursts of laughter and cheers whenever someone hit a high note or showed off a fancy move. She sat still, clutching her song sheet, reminding herself to breathe. Hours passed before her turn came. As she waited backstage, she could hear the muffled voices of the judges through the curtain. People laughed, clapped, or groaned as contestants came and went. Her heart pounded like a drum. She had never been so nervous. "Contestant 248, you're next," a stagehand called. Sarah stood up slowly, her knees shaking. She stepped toward the light. When she walked onto the stage, the crowd went quiet for a moment. Then a few people chuckled softly. She looked different from everyone before her. No makeup, no sparkly outfit, just a plain blue dress and kind eyes. One of the judges leaned forward, smiling politely but skeptically. "Hello there, what's your name?" he asked. "I'm Sarah Jenkins," she answered, her voice trembling. "And what will you be performing for us today?" Another judge asked. "I'll be singing I Dreamed a Dream," she replied. Gripping the microphone tightly, the audience exchanged glances. Some smiled as if expecting a funny moment. Sarah could feel their doubt washing over her. She heard whispers, small laughs, and someone mutter, "Oh no, not this song again." Her cheeks turned warm, but she didn't look away. Instead, she closed her eyes and remembered her father's words from long ago. "If you sing from your heart, Sarah, someone will listen." The music started softly, a single piano note echoing through the hall. She took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly. The lights felt too bright, and for a second she wanted to run away. But then she thought about her quiet life, her dreams, and how far she had come just to stand there. She opened her mouth to sing the first note, and in that moment, everything else disappeared, and the laughter, the fear, the lights all gone. No one expected what came next. The moment Sarah finished saying the name of her song, a quiet wave of doubt moved through the room. People shifted in their seats. and the judges leaned back slightly. One of them smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile that showed faith. It was the kind that said, "Let's just see what happens." Sarah could almost feel the air thick with judgment, as if everyone had already decided how her story would end before it even began. She stood there under the blinding lights, her heart beating so fast it felt like everyone could hear it. The microphone felt heavier than before. She looked at the faces in front of her, rows of strangers with crossed arms and expectant eyes. A few people were already whispering. One woman in the front row whispered something to her friend, who covered her mouth to hide a laugh. Sarah heard it and her chest tightened, but she didn't move. She kept her hands steady on the mic, trying to control her breathing. The judges' table gleamed under the lights. 4 people sitting with perfect posture, their expressions trained to hide what they truly thought. The first judge, a man with sharp eyes, leaned toward his microphone. "So, Sarah," he said, "you've never performed before, right?" Sarah shook her head. "Not on a stage like this," she answered softly. He nodded, pretending to be encouraging, but his tone carried a trace of disbelief. "Well, good luck then," he said, and leaned back again behind the curtain. The stage crew whispered, waiting for the next cue. The pianist placed his fingers on the keys. Waiting for her signal, Sarah gave a small nod. The music began, slow, gentle, familiar, yet her voice was still silent. She hesitated, afraid the first sound she made would betray her nerves. The audience waited, impatient. Someone coughed loudly, a few giggled. In that fragile silence, Sarah thought about the bakery, the smell of warm bread, the customers who smiled when she sang quietly while kneading dough. They always told her she had a lovely voice, but she never truly believed them until now. Now she needed to. She needed to believe in herself more than anyone else ever had. She opened her mouth and began to sing. Her first note trembled, a thin sound that barely reached the back of the hall, and for a second the whispers grew louder. A young man in the audience sighed, muttering, "Told you so." But Sarah didn't stop. She steadied herself, closed her eyes, and reached deeper into her heart. She imagined her father sitting in the front row, smiling proudly the way he used to, and suddenly, her voice grew stronger, clearer, more alive. The judges exchanged looks, uncertain whether what they were hearing was real. One leaned slightly forward, eyebrows raised. Another tapped her pen slowly against the desk, a small rhythm that seemed to match Sarah's heartbeat. The laughter faded, replaced by quiet curiosity. Something was shifting, slowly but surely, but the doubt still lingered, not just in the audience, but inside her too as she sang each line. A small voice in her head whispered, "They don't believe in you. They think you're just a joke." And every time that thought came, she fought it back with another note, louder, purer, stronger. She sang not just to prove them wrong, but to remind herself of everything she had lost and everything she still had left. The crowd began to listen more closely, not because they were amazed yet, but because they didn't expect her to last this long without faltering. Her voice began to fill the theater, echoing off the walls, soft and haunting. The same song they'd heard 100 times before now sounded different. It carried a kind of truth that couldn't be faked. When she reached the middle of the song, something extraordinary happened. The judge, who had been smiling skeptically earlier, put down his pen. His expression changed. He wasn't just watching a contestant anymore. He was watching a story unfold, one that was touching something deep within him. The audience too began to quiet down. The whispers faded into silence. A child sitting in the third row rested her chin on her mother's shoulder. Even the cameraman stopped adjusting his lens, afraid to break the moment. Sarah's voice floated through the air like a secret that had waited years to be heard. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, raw, and full of soul. For the first time, the doubt in the room began to fade, replaced by something softer, something that felt like hope. People leaned forward in their seats, realizing they had misjudged her, that the woman in the plain blue dress had something no one else on that stage had. Honesty, her song wasn't about showing off. It was about surviving, about finding beauty in the broken. As she sang the final lines, her eyes opened slowly. She saw faces that had been mocking her now frozen in awe. The same people who had laughed were now silent, their eyes shining. A lump formed in her throat, but she pushed through to the last note, holding it longer than she thought possible. When the music faded, the room stayed still. No one moved, no one spoke for a moment. It was as if time had stopped. Sarah lowered the microphone. Her hands trembling, she looked down, afraid to see their reactions, afraid the laughter might return, but it didn't. The silence wasn't cold anymore, it was warm, heavy and filled with emotion. Then somewhere in the back, Someone started to clap, slowly at first, then louder. More joined in until the entire hall was applauding. Sarah stood frozen, her eyes wide. She had entered the stage to laughter. But now, for the first time, she was hearing applause meant for her. Real applause, and she couldn't hold back her tears. The crowd had finally gone quiet. But Sarah could still feel the echo of their earlier laughter deep inside her chest. It hadn't fully disappeared, it stayed there, like a shadow behind her heart, reminding her of how quickly people judge what they don't understand. She stood alone on that wide stage, the bright lights shining down, and for a second she felt very small, like a single drop in a vast ocean. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear alone, but from the weight of the moment. This was everything she had ever dreamed of. And yet it didn't look like the dream she'd imagined. The air was too cold, the silence too heavy, the judge's eyes too sharp. She looked toward them and saw 4 faces waiting, their pens ready, their expressions calm, professional, almost distant. The stage assistant gave her a small nod. It was the signal, the one that meant the music would begin. Sarah took a deep breath, the kind that fills the lungs and steadies the heart. She looked out at the audience again, hundreds of faces staring back. Some curious, some doubtful, a few smiling kindly, but most simply waiting to be entertained. She could almost hear their thoughts, this woman. Really, what can she possibly do? She closed her eyes for a moment, shutting out the lights and the whispers. In the darkness behind her eyelids, she saw her little kitchen back home. She saw her father sitting by the window, humming along while she sang as a child. She remembered the warmth of those afternoons, the smell of baking bread, the safety of small moments. Those memories became her courage. The pianist began to play, the first soft notes floating gently through the air. It was a slow melody, tender and sad, and for a moment, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Sarah kept her eyes closed, listening to the rhythm, feeling the music move through her like a heartbeat. Her fingers loosened their grip on the microphone and she whispered silently to herself, "You belong here, just sing." When she finally opened her eyes, something inside her had changed. Her fear hadn't vanished, but it had softened. It had turned into something else, something like quiet determination. She took another breath and prepared to sing, but just before the first note left her lips, she noticed something strange in the audience. A little girl sitting in the front row, no older than 8, was watching her with wide, sparkling eyes, the kind that believed in magic. That tiny face reminded Sarah of herself at that age, dreaming big, believing anything was possible. It gave her strength. She smiled softly. Just a flicker of a smile, then raised the microphone. The music swelled slightly. The time had come behind the judges' table. One of them scribbled something on a notepad. Another adjusted his glasses. They were ready to listen, but not yet ready to believe. Sarah could feel their hesitation, but she didn't let it stop her. She leaned slightly forward, her posture calm, her eyes bright, and then, right before she sang, there was an unexpected pause. It wasn't planned. The pianist stopped, thinking she had lost her timing, but Sarah lifted one hand gently to signal him to wait. She took another breath, this time slower, deeper, the microphone close to her lips, and in that pause, a strange magic filled the air, the kind that only comes before something unforgettable happens. The audience didn't know what to make of it. Some leaned forward, confused. Others whispered to each other. One judge frowned slightly, but Sarah stood still, quiet and graceful, as if she were listening to something no one else could hear. It wasn't the music she was waiting for. It was the moment, the right moment, the one that felt like the universe was finally listening. The pianist looked at her uncertainly, but she nodded again and he began to play once more. This time Sarah was ready. She began to sing, her voice soft, trembling slightly but rich with emotion. The first line slipped into the air like a fragile ribbon of sound, barely audible yet pure. It was the kind of voice that made people lean in closer without realizing it. The room grew still. Even the lights seemed to dim a little, as if they too wanted to listen. Every note carried a story. Every word carried a lifetime of quiet pain and unspoken dreams. Her voice rose gently, each phrase building stronger than the last. People who had laughed now sat in silence, their smiles fading into awe. The judge's pen stopped moving. One of them tilted his head slightly, listening as if trying to understand where this power was coming from. Sarah didn't see any of it. She was lost in her own world now. She wasn't on a stage anymore. She was back home singing to her father, to her younger self, to every person who had ever doubted her. The song wasn't just a performance. It was a confession, a prayer, a promise. By the time she reached the chorus, her voice filled every corner of the theater. Strong but tender, trembling but unstoppable, people began to shift in their seats, not out of impatience, but emotion. Something inside them was being touched, something they hadn't expected to feel that night. Tears welled in the eyes of the same woman who had laughed earlier. The judges sat straighter. The lights shimmered softly across the stage, and Sarah, the woman no one believed in, stood there glowing, her voice carrying years of silence and strength. Then, as the final notes of the song approached, she took one last breath, holding it for just a heartbeat longer. The pianist slowed down, the melody fading like a sunset, and when the last note finally left her lips, the world felt still, timeless, sacred. She lowered the microphone, her chest rising and falling. The silence that followed was so deep it felt almost unreal. That was the moment before the applause, the moment before everything changed, the moment when the world saw Sarah Jenkins, not as a joke, not as a plain woman from a bakery, but as a voice that could make strangers weep and hearts remember what it means to feel. The first note left Sarah's lips like a whisper turning into light, soft and uncertain at first, then strong and steady. It floated through the hall, weaving through the air, touching every corner of the vast theater. The audience, who had been whispering moments ago, fell into complete silence. Even the sound of someone shifting in their seats stopped. It was as if the world itself had paused just to listen. Her voice was unlike anything they had expected. It wasn't polished like the voices of trained singers. It wasn't the kind that aimed to impress with fancy runs or loud high notes. It was something else entirely. It was real. It was honest. It was filled with life. Every crack and tremble carried truth. Every word carried meaning, and people could feel it deep inside. The judges looked at each other in quiet surprise, their pens frozen above their papers. One of them, who had rolled his eyes before the song began, now leaned forward, his expression softening. Another judge, who had been ready to press her buzzer, now rested her chin on her hand, mesmerized. Sarah's voice reached them in a way no contestant had all evening. As she sang, memories flooded her heart. The mornings in her bakery, the laughter of her coworkers, the smell of fresh bread, the sound of rain against her kitchen window. She thought about the times she sang quietly to herself, believing no one would ever hear her, and now, all those hidden songs were rising up. Finally free, her voice grew stronger, richer, more confident. Each note seemed to carry the weight of her years, the struggles, the loneliness, and the quiet hope that had never died. The melody swelled. Her eyes glistened under the stage lights, and as she sang the most emotional part of the song, something magical happened. People in the audience began to cry, not because the lyrics were sad, but because the feeling behind them was too real to ignore. She wasn't just performing, and she was opening her soul. And in doing so, she reminded everyone of their own hidden dreams, their own forgotten courage. Her song became theirs. One man in the back wiped his eyes and smiled through his tears. A young woman clutched her chest, whispering, "She's amazing." Even the camera operators, used to seeing countless acts come and go, stood still, afraid to make a sound. Sarah could feel the energy shift. The room that had once been cold now felt warm, alive, welcoming. She didn't need to see their faces to know. They were with her, completely. She could feel it in the stillness, in the silence that wasn't empty but full of connection. Her voice rose again, soaring higher and higher, trembling slightly, but filled with so much heart that even the smallest flaw sounded perfect. It was the kind of singing that didn't need perfection, because it had truth, and truth always finds its way into people's hearts. When she reached the bridge of the song, her voice cracked for just a moment, but instead of ruining the moment, it made it even more powerful. It was a sound of vulnerability, of humanity, and it broke through every wall of doubt still left in the room. Even the judges, who had built their careers on being tough, couldn't hide their emotions. One of them blinked rapidly, fighting tears. Another smiled softly, whispering, "Beautiful." Sarah didn't notice their tears. She was lost inside the song. It felt like flying, like finally breathing after holding her breath for years. The fear she had carried since stepping onto the stage was gone, replaced by a calm sense of belonging. She didn't care about winning anymore. All that mattered was that her voice was heard, truly heard, as she sang the final verse. Her tone softened again, tender, delicate like a gentle breeze. Her eyes scanned the crowd for just a second. She saw faces shining with emotion. Strangers who had come expecting entertainment but were leaving with something much deeper. She saw the little girl in the front row again, her eyes wide and full of wonder. and Sarah smiled faintly, singing that last line straight to her. Then came the final note, long, breathtaking. It seemed to hang in the air forever, shimmering like sunlight on water, and when it finally faded, there was no sound at all, no clapping, no cheering, just a heavy, beautiful silence. For a few seconds, Sarah thought she had failed. Her hands trembled slightly as she lowered the microphone. She looked down, her heart sinking. Maybe they hadn't liked it after all. Maybe the silence meant disappointment. But then, one single clap echoed from the back row, slow and steady. Then another joined in, then another, until the sound grew louder, stronger, unstoppable. In seconds, the entire audience was on its feet, clapping, cheering, shouting her name. The sound of their applause filled the hall like thunder. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. She covered her mouth in disbelief. She could see the judges smiling, standing too, one of them mouthing the words, "Thank you." It wasn't just applause, it was respect, it was redemption. It was the sound of people realizing they had misjudged her completely. The woman who had walked on stage as a joke had now become the voice that silenced them all. Her song had changed the air in that room. It had melted hearts, erased doubt, and reminded everyone that sometimes the most extraordinary beauty hides in the most ordinary people. Sarah bowed her head gently, tears rolling down her cheeks. She whispered softly to herself, "Dad, I did it," and smiled. The applause still echoed through the hall when the judges looked at each other in disbelief. They had just witnessed something they hadn't expected. Something rare. The kind of performance that didn't just impress. It changed the air in the room. Sarah stood under the soft glow of the spotlight, her eyes glistening, her chest rising and falling as she tried to breathe through the wave of emotion washing over her. For a long moment no one spoke. The judges sat frozen, their expressions a mix of awe and guilt. They had all misjudged her when she first walked on stage. They saw only an ordinary woman. Plain clothes, nervous smile, trembling hands, and now, that same woman had just delivered one of the most unforgettable performances of their careers. The first judge to speak was Daniel, known for his sharp tongue and brutal honesty. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his voice softer than anyone had ever heard it. "Sarah," he said slowly, "I'll be honest, when you came out, I didn't expect much." A few people in the audience chuckled nervously. Remembering their own laughter, Daniel shook his head slightly. "But then you started singing, and I swear, I've never been so wrong." His eyes were wet, though he tried to hide it. The second judge, Clara, who was usually calm and analytical, was visibly moved. She had been the one ready to press the rejection buzzer before Sarah's first note. Now she couldn't take her eyes off her. "You know," she began softly, "we hear thousands of voices every year, but very few of them make us feel something real. You did that, Sarah. You made me feel something I haven't felt in a long time." Her voice trembled and she smiled through her tears. The third judge, a young pop star named Mia, leaned closer to her microphone. She looked at Sarah with admiration, her usual playful energy replaced with sincerity. "When you walked on that stage," she said, "people laughed, including me. The crowd went silent. But then you opened your mouth and suddenly everyone was quiet. I've been on this show for years and I've never seen a moment like that. You reminded me why I started singing in the first place." The final judge, an older musician named George, who rarely spoke more than a few words, took off his glasses and wiped his eyes. "I've been in this industry for 50 years, he said, his voice deep and emotional. "And sometimes we forget what real music is. It's not about fame, it's not about perfect notes. It's about truth, and tonight you brought truth back to this stage." The audience erupted in applause again. Louder this time, Sarah stood there speechless, her hands trembling as she held the microphone. She could barely believe what she was hearing. These were people who had built careers out of criticism, who had laughed with the crowd when she walked out, and now they were standing in front of her not as judges but as admirers. The camera zoomed in on her face, tears rolling down her cheeks, her smile small but radiant. The host stepped onto the stage, grinning. "Sarah Jenkins, you've just made history here tonight," he said. The crowd cheered again and she laughed softly, shaking her head as if still in disbelief. Behind the judges' table, Daniel turned to Clara and whispered, "We almost missed this." Clara nodded. "We almost missed her." They both looked back at Sarah, standing under the golden lights, looking both fragile and strong, ordinary yet extraordinary, and they knew this moment would be remembered. As the applause began to fade, Sarah finally spoke, her voice shaking slightly. "Thank you," she said. I didn't come here expecting anything, I just wanted to sing. Because music has always been my home. Her words were simple, but they struck deep. The crowd cheered again, some shouting her name, others wiping away tears. The judges all stood giving her a standing ovation. It wasn't just respect, it was redemption, an apology without words. A recognition of the courage it takes to stand before the world and still be yourself. Sarah bowed her head, smiling through her tears. And for a brief moment, time felt still again. When the show went to a commercial break, the judges stayed seated, still talking quietly about what they had just witnessed. Daniel said softly, "She reminded me that music isn't about perfection. It's about honesty." Clara nodded. "It's about heart," Mia added. "And she's got plenty of that." George smiled faintly. She reminded us why we fell in love with music backstage. The producers were already calling it the performance of the season. The crew members were emotional too. Some clapped, others hugged each other, even the host, who had seen countless contestants over the years, looked teary-eyed. He said quietly, "We just saw something real tonight." Sarah walked off stage slowly, still hearing the faint echo of applause behind her. She passed the same people who had laughed before her performance, but now they looked at her differently, with respect, admiration, even apology. One young contestant stopped her and said, "You were amazing. You made me believe again." Sarah smiled, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Never stop believing," she whispered as she disappeared down the hallway. Her reflection in the mirror caught her attention. She stopped for a moment and looked at herself, the same plain woman in a blue dress. But now she saw something new in her eyes. Strength, peace, pride. She smiled softly and whispered, "You did it, Sarah." Meanwhile, back in the theater, the judges were still talking. Daniel turned to the producers and said, "Mark my words, this is the moment people will remember. Not because she won, but because she reminded us that greatness can come from anywhere." The others nodded, and in that quiet after the storm, everyone felt changed. The audience had come to see a show, but they had witnessed a story, a transformation not just of one woman, but of everyone who had doubted her that night. The laughter that once filled the room was replaced by tears, applause, and a newfound respect for the power of a single, honest voice. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to stand still. Sarah stood frozen under the golden light, the microphone still warm in her trembling hands. She could feel her heart beating faster than ever, the echoes of her song still hanging in the air like a soft memory that refused to fade. It was quiet, too quiet. She didn't dare look up, afraid that the silence might mean disappointment. Then out of nowhere, one person in the back row began to clap. A single sound that sliced through the stillness. Sharp and honest, the second clap followed, then another, and within seconds the entire theater erupted. Applause thundered through the room like a storm breaking the sky. People jumped to their feet, their cheers rolling forward in waves. Sarah looked up in disbelief, her eyes wide, her lips parting as if to ask, "Is this really for me?" Everywhere she looked, people were standing, clapping, shouting, some with tears streaming down their faces, others smiling so wide their cheeks hurt. It was not the polite kind of applause contestants often got. It was the kind that came from deep emotion, from being touched by something real, from being humbled by a truth too beautiful to ignore. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She pressed her hand against her chest, trying to calm the rush of feelings flooding through her. She could see the judges standing too, clapping along with everyone else. Their faces soft, their eyes shining. Clara wiped her tears openly. Daniel nodded to her with a proud smile. Mia blew a kiss in the air, and George simply bowed his head. A gesture of respect. The lights brightened. Bathing Sarah in a golden glow, the camera zoomed in, capturing her tearful smile, her shaking shoulders, the disbelief etched across her face. The host stepped forward, his voice nearly drowned out by the cheering. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said with excitement, "please give it up one more time for the incredible Sarah Jenkins." The crowd roared again, louder this time, the sound rolling like thunder through every inch of the hall. Sarah tried to speak but couldn't. Her voice broke before any words came. She covered her mouth, laughing through her tears, shaking her head. It felt unreal. She had entered that stage expecting laughter and left it wrapped in love. She raised one hand slowly, a small wave of gratitude, and the audience answered with another roar of applause. The moment belonged to her completely. Backstage, the crew watched the monitors, some clapping, others just staring in awe. They'd seen thousands of auditions, but none like this, one cameraman whispered. "That's history right there." Another nodded. She changed the whole mood of the show. In the crowd, The same people who had mocked her earlier now looked at her with admiration. One woman leaned toward her friend and said, "I feel awful for laughing at her." Her friend nodded, wiping away tears. "She just reminded me that we all judge too quickly." And just like that, Sarah's song became more than a performance. It became a lesson. A mirror reflecting everyone's humanity back at them. Sarah finally found her voice. It was soft, trembling, but full of warmth. "Thank you," she said into the microphone, her words barely audible over the cheers. I don't know what to say," she laughed through the tears, her shoulders shaking. "I just wanted to sing. I never imagined this." The audience responded with a wave of applause so loud that the walls seemed to tremble. As she looked out at the sea of faces, something beautiful happened. Strangers began chanting her name, "Sarah, Sarah." Sarah, the sound filled her ears, her heart, her soul. She smiled wider, her tears shining under the lights for the first time in her life. She felt seen, truly seen. The host stepped beside her, his voice warm and steady. "Sarah, I think you just reminded all of us what real talent looks like," he said. And the crowd cheered again. Sarah laughed softly, shaking her head. "I just sang from my heart," she replied. And her simple words melted everyone's hearts even more. The judges came up to the stage one by one. Something that rarely happened. Clara hugged her first, whispering, "You were incredible." Daniel gave her a firm handshake and said, "You've got a gift, Sarah. Don't ever hide it again." Mia hugged her tightly, saying, "You're going to inspire so many people." And George placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, saying, "You made us remember what music really means." As they stood there together, the audience continued to cheer, phones raised high to record the moment. It wasn't just an audition anymore, it was history. Sarah wasn't just another contestant, she was a story, a symbol, a reminder that beauty often hides in plain sight, waiting for one brave moment to shine. When the applause finally began to fade, Sarah took one last look at the crowd, her smile soft and full of gratitude. She bowed deeply, her heart pounding with joy, and whispered to herself, "You did it, Dad. We did it." Then she turned and walked off the stage, each step feeling lighter than air. Backstage, people rushed to congratulate her. Crew members, contestants, even producers. Everyone wanted to shake her hand, hug her, tell her how she had touched their hearts, one young singer said tearfully. "You gave me hope." Sarah hugged her back and replied, "Never stop singing even when no one's listening." Outside, fans were already waiting. People she'd never met before shouting her name. Waving, taking pictures, it felt like a dream she never dared to dream. That night, as she sat alone in her small hotel room, she replayed the moment in her mind, the laughter, the fear, the silence, and then the applause. She smiled softly to herself, whispering, "They laughed when I walked out, but they cried when I sang." And somewhere deep in her heart she knew that single standing ovation wasn't just for her voice. It was for her courage, her honesty, her spirit. It was proof that sometimes the world only needs one person to remind it what real magic sounds like. The night after the performance felt like a dream. Sarah returned to her hotel room with her heart still racing. Her ears still ringing from the applause. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her hands as if they belonged to someone else. She could still feel the warmth of the microphone, still see the shining faces of people who once doubted her, but now looked at her like she was something extraordinary. Her phone buzzed endlessly on the nightstand, messages flooding in faster than she could read them. Friends, neighbors, even people she hadn't spoken to in years were texting her. "We saw you on TV. You were amazing. We cried watching you." Sarah covered her mouth, tears spilling from her eyes again. She laughed and cried all at once, overwhelmed by the sudden wave of love. Outside the window, the city lights sparkled, cars honked, and life went on as usual. But for Sarah, everything had changed. She felt lighter, freer, like she had finally broken through a wall she didn't even realize had been holding her back for years. She whispered softly to herself, "They heard me," and smiled. The next morning, she woke up to find her name all over the internet. Social media was flooded with clips of her performance. People were sharing her story with captions like, "Never judge a book by its cover," and "She made the world believe again." Hashtags with her name trended across multiple platforms. Millions of views, thousands of comments, all for the woman in the blue dress who no one believed in. Journalists called her the voice of courage, fans called her the bakery angel, and producers called her the surprise of the century. But Sarah didn't think of herself as any of those things. She was just the same woman who loved to sing while baking bread, Only now the whole world had finally heard her song. She received calls from talent agents, invitations to perform on other shows, interviews and magazine features. It all felt unreal. She even got a call from one of her old music teachers who said, "Sarah, I always knew you had something special." She smiled quietly, remembering how that same teacher once told her to focus on more practical things, Wayne. But there was no bitterness in her heart, only peace. Back in her small hometown, the bakery where she worked was busier than ever. Customers lined up not just for bread, but to meet the woman who made them proud. Little kids came in asking for autographs on napkins, and old customers hugged her, saying, "We always knew you could do it." The bakery smelled the same, but now it was filled with laughter, warmth, and pride. At night, Sarah would sit on her porch, sipping tea, watching the stars. Sometimes she replayed the performance in her mind. Every note, every tear, every clap. She thought about how life can change in a single moment. One brave step, one song, one decision to try, and she smiled, whispering, it was worth it. But fame wasn't the part she treasured most. It was the messages from people all over the world. From mothers, from dreamers, from those who had given up. One message read, "I was too afraid to sing in public, but after watching you, I'm going to try again." Another said, "You reminded me that I'm never too old to follow my dreams." Sarah read every single one, her heart swelling with gratitude. Sometimes, she still couldn't believe it was all real. She thought about that first day, the laughter, the whispers, the way she almost gave up before singing her first note. If she had walked away then, she would have missed everything, all the joy, all the connection, all the magic that came after. Weeks passed, and she was invited back to the show for a follow-up appearance. When she walked on stage again, the audience rose to their feet before she even sang a word. A full standing ovation before the first note. Sarah laughed softly, her eyes glistening. "You remembered me," she said. The crowd cheered even louder. This time she wasn't nervous, she wasn't scared, she felt at home, as if the stage had always been waiting for her. She sang again, not to prove anything, not to surprise anyone, but simply to share the joy in her heart. Her voice sounded stronger, fuller, alive with confidence and gratitude. By the end of her performance, people were crying again, and she knew she had done something bigger than win a competition. She had touched lives. When the show ended, the host said, "Sarah Jenkins reminded us all that dreams don't have an age. They just need courage." The audience cheered, and Sarah bowed, smiling through her tears. That moment became another memory she would carry forever. Later that night, back in her hotel room, she sat with her notebook open, writing the words that had been circling in her mind. "They laughed when I came out, but one performance made them weep," she paused, then added, "Not because I was special, but because I was real." She smiled, closing the notebook gently. Sarah knew her life would never be the same again. Not because of fame, but because she had found herself. She had found her voice, and in doing so, she had helped others find theirs too. She looked out the window one last time before bed, the moon shining softly over the city, and whispered, "Thank you." In the silence that followed, she realized something beautiful. The applause fades, the cameras stop, but the feeling of being true to yourself, that stays forever. And as she drifted to sleep, she smiled, knowing the world would remember her, not for how she looked when she walked on stage, but for how she made them feel when she sang. Years passed, but the memory of that night never faded. Sarah Jenkins became more than just a name on a television show. She became a story that people told when they needed hope, a reminder that dreams don't expire with age, and that courage can rise from the quietest corners of life. Every time her performance clip played online, new hearts were touched, new tears were shed, and new voices found the strength to be heard. Sarah's life had changed in ways she never could have imagined. The bakery was still there. The smell of warm bread still filled the air, but now it wasn't just a place for pastries. It was a place of inspiration. People traveled from faraway towns just to meet her, to take pictures, to tell her how her story had changed their lives. She always welcomed them with a smile, serving them coffee and listening to their stories. Because she knew how much being heard meant sometimes, she still performed. Small charity events, schools, hospitals, and even street corners where she could sing freely. She didn't need big stages or bright lights anymore. What she wanted was connection. Her songs weren't about fame. They were about feeling, and that was what made them so powerful. When she sang, people didn't just listen, they felt. They remembered, they healed one evening, She was invited to perform at a concert honoring inspirational figures. The crowd was huge, bigger than anything she'd ever seen before. But when she stepped on stage, she didn't feel fear. She felt peace. She wore her same blue dress, the one she wore that first night. A little faded now, but still full of meaning as she took the microphone. The audience recognized her immediately. The applause began before she even spoke. She smiled and said softly, "I once sang on a stage where everyone laughed when I walked out. But that night something beautiful happened." They stopped laughing. And they listened, the crowd cheered. Her voice trembled with emotion. And from that day on, I promised myself I would never stop singing. Not for fame, but for love. Her words carried through the air. Tender and true. When she began to sing, her voice was softer now, aged but still golden. It had a richness that only time and experience could give. People in the audience cried quietly, not because of sadness, but because of the honesty in her tone, the truth in every note. By the time she finished, the entire hall stood clapping and cheering. Another standing ovation. Another wave of love washing over her. After the show, a young woman approached her backstage, her hands trembling. "Miss Jenkins," she said, "I'm a singer too, but I've been too scared to perform. People always tell me I'm not good enough. But when I saw your story, I decided to try." "Thank you." Sarah smiled warmly and held the girl's hands. "You don't have to be perfect," she said softly. "You just have to be brave." The young woman nodded with tears in her eyes. And Sarah knew her journey had come full circle. Over the years, Sarah's story spread across the world. Schools taught her journey as a lesson in courage. Journalists wrote about her as the woman who turned laughter into tears. She became a symbol of resilience, of second chances, and of the magic that happens when you believe in yourself. Her picture hung in the bakery next to a small framed quote that read, "Dreams don't die. We just forget to chase them." And every customer who saw it smiled. Though fame faded, her impact only grew. She received letters from around the world. From soldiers, teachers, single parents, people who had felt invisible and found hope in her song. One letter read, "Your story made me get back on my feet." Another said, "You helped me remember who I am." Sarah kept every letter in a wooden box under her bed. Sometimes, when she couldn't sleep, she would open it, read a few lines, and smile through her tears. As the years went by, Sarah grew older, but her spirit remained young. She still sang in her kitchen, humming the same old songs while baking bread. Sometimes the local kids would stop by just to listen. They would sit cross-legged on the bakery floor as she sang softly, her voice wrapping around them like a warm blanket. When she finished, she would laugh and say, "See? That's what music is, and it's love that you can hear." One rainy afternoon, she was sitting by the window, watching raindrops race down the glass. When a news channel played a rerun of her audition, she smiled, listening to her younger self sing with that same trembling courage. The sound still gave her chills. She whispered, "You did it, Sarah. You really did it." Her reflection in the window smiled back at her, older, wiser, but still the same dreamer inside. And even when she wasn't around anymore, her voice lived on. Her song continued to be shared. Her story continued to be told. People remembered the woman in the blue dress, the one who walked on stage to laughter and left it to tears, the one who proved that dreams don't belong to the young or the famous, but to anyone brave enough to try. Children in school still watched her video, their teachers saying, "This is what courage looks like." And somewhere in the crowd of dreamers and believers, there was always someone who whispered, "If she could do it, maybe I can too." Sarah Jenkins had become more than a singer. She had become a reminder that no matter where you come from, no matter how ordinary your life seems, you can still shine, you can still move hearts, and you can still change the world with something as simple and powerful as your voice. And so her legacy lived on, not in fame or fortune, but in every person who dared to dream again after hearing her story, in every trembling voice that found the courage to sing, in every tear that fell because truth had touched the heart, and in every soul that finally believed that sometimes the most beautiful miracles begin with a single note.